Improving website performance. A look at the evolution of resource loading with Henri Helvetica.
All right, so for those wondering, that is a landscape of the greatest city in the world, which I'll talk about in a hot minute. But even though it is the afternoon on the East Coast, but it's probably morning everywhere else. So for the 10 of you, or maybe less, who follow me on Twitter, I like to start my days with a greeting to the Dom. So I always say, good morning, Dom. Sometimes she answers back. But what I do want to do is wish everyone a Happy New Year. I'm glad to be given the opportunity to be the first certified fresh event webinar of the year. So thank you very much for that. Glad everyone could join. And I mean, I sort of mentioned this earlier, but drop a flag or what city you're from and let me know. I'd love to find out. So this is my second webinar ever, so please be easy on me. So we're going to get right into it. So this is basically going to be a performance tale. I'm a bit of a raconteur. I like to sort of give my talks in a bit of a story format. So we are going to talk about performance in a bit in that kind of fashion. I'm a bit of a fan of history, actually, whether it be web or anything else, which is why I'm actually jealous I'm not going to be able to make it to Brian's flashback conference, which I think you should all attend because I think it's going to be fantastic. But like I said, this is going to be about a story, and it's actually going to be based on a book that came out about 10 years ago, and how things really got started on the performance end. But I'm going to share with you how I got started on performance. It really started around retina images. So what happened one day was I was at this agency I worked at, and I think it was like some new iPhones came out. They had like retina screens. And I think we also got a bunch of the new iPhone Pluses, whatever the bigger sizes. And I thought it was super interesting. And I was starting to dig into the retina image thing. And I found out, I was like, okay, more data. All right, bigger images. Oh, okay, I think I get it. And I had this sort of, moment of clarity where I suddenly understood that this was going to be a bit more data and more data consumption. So right after that, I started to really get into performance. I started to attend the local meetup and a few other things like that. Now, for those who remember, there used to be a conference called, well, actually it's still around, but Velocity Conference used to be a performance-based conference. They used to have talks about performance. And now it's more a little bit of a DevOps thing, and they've dropped the performance conversation from it. But the biggest thing is that I started to watch some of their videos. For those who do remember, they used to have the keynotes streaming live, and I would watch them, just super get inspired and whatnot. And that also led me to more O'Reilly material, because this was presented by O'Reilly. O'Reilly Media used to actually put out a lot of books. And for some reason, they put out the majority of the performance literature print. And I just started to dig in. And I eventually started to grab like literally every book that had any kind of performance conversation associated with it, whether it be a few chapters or an entire book. So that eventually led me to a book called High Performance Websites. It was a book by Steve Souders, who was an engineer at the time, I believe, at Yahoo. But it was absolutely instrumental in the web community and how people looked at performance. He had been doing a little bit of research, and he had actually distilled his research down to a number of rules. And those rules we're actually going to look at today. But one common thread within the writing in that book and some of his presentations around that time, which was about 2007, 2008, was he talked about the user experience. And this was actually still kind of new to me, because I just thought, performance was like, oh man, it's about speed, 0 to 100, how fast can you run, how quickly can you download some resources. That's all I was thinking. but he kept talking about the user experience and how that needed to be looked after all the time. And, it started to sink into me. And I realized eventually that we actually, as developers or front-end engineers or whatever you want to call yourselves, we became dealers of user experience specifically. And as we, ideally put together our sites and whatnot, we want to make sure that no matter what happened, that the user experience was a pleasurable one. And ultimately, if we took that a step further, we actually became, experts in the delivery of UX. Because once again, UX being central in all things that we had to do in terms of making sure that, yes, the performance had to be good, proper, but the user experience absolutely had to be one that something that we looked after. So ultimately, when Souders collected this data and did all this research, he came down with these rules. User experience was definitely a main thread in that conversation. So we are going to look at these rules today. Specifically, there were 14 of them. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the 14 Rules RedUx. It's a retrospective of web performance and the modern improvements that have been done along the way to sort of deal with the modern web. But the 14 rules we're going to look at are going to be very reflective of a time, or a bit of a different time, in fact, on the web. So with that being said, let's get going. Yes, my name's Henri. I am French. And if you could say Henri, that's amazing. If you can't, I answered to Henry. Don't worry about that. Now, this is my Twitter handle. It's my Instagram handle too, but I'm best on Twitter. My last name is not Helvetica. It's just a nom de plume that I use, and it just seems to work. So I also use it at conferences as well. And I'm sorry, but I'm from the greatest city on the planet. It's called Toronto. Yes, I'm in Canada, not Toronto, Kansas. But as you can see, there are 3 O's there and 3 A's. So chances are you could probably minify that. I'm a freelance developer in Toronto. I run the Toronto Web Performance Meetup. I recently started the Jamstack Meetup in Toronto as well, just out of curiosity. And I also do some consulting with conferences with regards to content and speakers, et cetera, et cetera. So now I'm going to give you a quick some personal info about myself. And I'm an avid distance runner. I run 5Ks mostly, some 10s, but I don't run marathons. And I recently, a couple of years ago, actually, I did a campaign with Nike around running. But I talk about this specifically because one thing that I want to do is try to get developers and designers, in fact, to be a bit more active, because we spend our days at computers all the time, sitting down, maybe standing up. But I just hope that some of us could be a little bit more active in the future. So that's going to be a 2020 goal for me. Anyhow, I also want to thank Brian and the good people at CFE, Certified Fresh Events, for having me. It was an honor for him to reach out and say, hey, do you want to do this? I was totally down. And I thought it also fit with the theme of his conference coming up, because it is a bit of a flashback / and I'm doing a retrospective. So that being said, let's get going. Now, this is really about a gentleman by the name of Steve Souders. He was an engineer at Yahoo at the time, and he had been curious about web performance. But, and he's pretty much associated with web performance in general, having written that book. But I used to call him actually sometimes pontiff of performance. On certain days, I call him the sovereign of speed. But the funny thing is that before writing the book, Steve believed that performance was largely a back-end issue. He didn't really pay any mind, but he felt, whatever, like dealing with databases and whatnot. I'm sorry, my phone's going. Dealing with databases the whole time. And he thought that performance was like, it's not a huge deal. But he would eventually find out that he was wrong. And predating his book, and I can't blame him, because predating his book, there was a piece of literature that came out around performance. It was about 2000, 2002. And once again, with the belief that things were in the back end, they used to ask questions like, is your modem on? That was literally a performance checklist. Are you surfing at slow times? Things like, is your browser hanging? These are literally checklists that were printed in this book. This is actually pretty interesting as well. Even back then, are excessive images dragging you down or dragging down your performance, et cetera, et cetera. And there's another bit right here. Are you using a slow browser? Yes, and there's more back-end material to talk about, but this is what they once believed. But Steve began to do a little bit of research, poked around, looked around to see what was going on. And then he found out that around 5% of time was spent in the back end. And he thought, like, how is that possible? Really? And he kept doing the research, kept doing some testing, kept getting some measurements. And he eventually found out that 95% of wait time was actually spent in the front. So he now had to reframe his thinking, and he came out with a golden rule. 80 to 90% of performance is the front end, and that's pretty much it. And that's something I remember when he said that the first time, it kind of stuck with me. And that's something that I quickly discuss with anyone who will talk about, like, oh, are you a front end person, back end person, et cetera, et cetera. But when they mention the front end, I'm like, well, that's where all the chaos happens. Well, quite a lot of it. And at that point, he had kept digging around, kept doing a bit more research, and he came out with this tool called YSlow. Some of you may remember it. This actually predates, believe it or not, web page tests, which I'm going to talk about a little later. And it looked a little like this. Now, this tool basically allowed you to grade a website. You could actually put in the URL, and it would give you this sort of like A, B, C, D, E kind of grading on some of the rules that he eventually developed. And these rules were distilled into a book. And the book that I was telling you about, High Performance Websites, looked specific like this. Essential Knowledge for the Front-End Engineer. And this was released in about around 2007. And you'll see at the top it says 14 steps to faster loading websites. So what we're going to do today is look at these 14 rules. And like I said, this was released in 2007. And we're going to see how these would fare in today's web. So 14 rules, let's look at them. Rule number 1, make fewer HTTP requests. Well, the one thing that I like to talk about when it comes to requests is the quickest request is the one that's never made. And that's absolutely true and will ring true forever. You'll find out that sometimes you may have a website with like hundreds of requests. Potentially, some might not be necessary. Who knows? These are conversations that you'll have with your team. But the one thing that, again, will ring true is that the quickest request is the one that's never made. So if you can avoid making too many requests, do so. Now, I mentioned here image sprites, inlining images, and combining scripts. We won't get into that so much right now. But the fact is, the point of these processes was to combine assets so that you can have less requests being made over the wire. So ultimately, is making fewer HTTP requests something that you'd want to do in 2020? I'd say absolutely. Now, if you look at some of this data from HTTP Archive, a website, by the way, that you should absolutely check out, you'll see the way requests have changed over time. We have 2011, which is the earliest time that we can get some of this data from HA, which is HTTP Archive, by the way, and 2019. And you'll see that the requests have absolutely increased. And in fact, at the median of 69 requests, in 2019 is up 305% versus 2011. So these are things that you absolutely want to keep in mind. Now, rule number 2 was use a CDN. Yeah, sounds pretty decent. And in 2020, probably. What did the CDN do? Well, it helped with issues of latency, which is ultimately, when you talk about web performance, I mean, latency is pretty much a problem across the web, period. You know, resources have to get loaded as fast as possible, and we have a lot of bottlenecks along the way, a lot of friction along the way. Caching static resources at the edge worldwide, obviously that's always going to help. More important, and that's more important than ever in 2020. Why? Because we have tons of images. Why? We have a lot of video being used, media in general. So CDN will never hurt. So in 2020, is that something you want to use? Absolutely. Now, here's a little bit of statistic. Out of 460 million requests the HTTP archive, as per the HTTP archive, 48% were not served from a CDN. And that's by Paul Calvano, who's actually an engineer at Akamai. And if you're on Twitter, you absolutely need to follow this gentleman. But what this tells us is that there's absolutely room for improvement if only half of the requests that you can send to a CDN are being sent there. Something to think about. Now, rule number 3 was add expire headers. Now, again, this is all about caching static content. Also a check on resource freshness. And I was trying to be cute here, but caching is caching, meaning you can actually make an argument that proper caching is going to save you money. And so in 2020, once again, expire headers. Is this important? You absolutely bet you is. Now, let's look at some more data. And this is part, again, of the HTTP archive. This actually might be CRUX data, so Chrome user experience data. And you can see right here where this is a chart of caching scores. Now, under 10%, the number of sites, quite high. Basically, this chart is showing us that there's a lot of room to grow here as well. And the savings associated with proper caching as well. This chart will show you that there's still a lot of room to grow here and save more bytes. Now, another number 4, gzip components. Well, I'll start by saying this. The foundation of the whole internet is compression. And that's by Colt McCandless, who's an engineer at Google right now. So with that being said, gzipping components, it's essential to the transfer of resources, absolutely. Welcome where available, massive savings when well-tuned. So once again, in 2020, is this going to be something that you want to make sure you do? You bet. And it's actually always surprising the amount of compression that's not being done when possible. Again, gzipping, you want to make sure that all your text assets are being compressed, so JavaScript, CSS, SVGs, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in fact, here's some data that was taken from a website called WPOstats.com, if you want to go check that out. It's something that's curated by Tammy Everts and Tim Hadlick, pardon me. Netflix saw a 43% decrease in their bandwidth bill after turning on gzip. Little flick of the switch, that's all it took. Now, once again, some of these things are oversights, so it's really important that you sort of dig in to make sure everything is done well. And especially when you're looking at companies that work at scale like Netflix, these are significant savings. Now, let's look at some compression scores here. Now, you'll see again right here, there's a lot of room to improve overall and to grow. And these are things you can look at afterwards as well. Now we get a little gangster. Put style sheets at the top. Okay, I mean, that's not so bad. Once believed ordered we once believed order mattered very little. At the time, IE was a leading browser. Critical CSS async loading came into play. Absolutely. Non-progressive loading, flash of unstyled, flash of unstyled. Oh, I made a mistake here. Okay, don't worry about that. But nonetheless, putting style sheets at the top, is that something that you want to make sure you're doing? Probably so. I mean, you're not going to go anywhere with having style sheets at the bottom. Again, a lot of these rules, we could probably spend like a half hour like dissecting. I'm just kind of going to race through them. But this is something that, yes, in 2020, this is still going to matter. Now, one that's really interesting, putting scripts at the bottom. I have to put in like the little eyes emoji because that's something that, again, in 2007, there are a lot of things that we didn't know at the time, but synchronous script blocked the DOM construction. Then came script injections that blocked the CSS-OM. Now, asyncing, defer, all came afterwards. And ultimately, scripts in 2020 are very complicated. They are basically an area of constant sort of discussion, experimentation. Browsers are doing everything they can to make sure that scripts aren't really as caustic as they are, but this has been a challenge. Absolutely. And in fact, if you start to look at the JavaScript payload, and again, this is from the HTTP archive. By the way, if you ever get a chance, you need to check out that piece of that release they had, which was called the Web Almanac, which was really interesting data. And this is part of it, in fact. So this is the JavaScript payload, again, between 2011 and 2019, and you see where it's gone. So dealing with JavaScript is very important. 7, avoid CSS expression. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but it was really interesting because this is a moment in time where IE was the dominant browser, believe it or not. And I was trying to be cute here, but we complain about CSS and JS, but this was literally JS and CSS. It was a bit of a hack, completely deprecated, not to matter. So this was nothing that we ever really looked at ever again. Make JS and CSS external. Absolutely. This was a bit, a combination of a couple rules, but it is to this day proven to be, a fast alternative. Absolutely. Because again, you'll be able to do some caching with that, et cetera, et cetera. What time is it? Okay, we're not too bad. 12:30. So in 2020, is this something that we're still going to employ? Yes, we are. Reduce DNS lookups. Now, this gets a little bit more interesting as well. Now, as I like to say, you have less requests, you have less lookups, that's for sure. But the problem with DNS lookups is they don't come for free, they're quite expensive. There's quite a process in getting a resource loaded, and DNS lookups can be pretty expensive over time. And it's a cost, like I said, of many variables. Now, resolver, current load, bandwidth, proximity to hosts, these are all things that play into it, which is why we have a resource hint, which I'm going to talk about a little later, like DNS prefetch, because one of the goals was to decrease or manage the expense of the DNS lookup. Now, in 2020, would this be something that we look into? Absolutely. This is still very important. And in fact, this is just a screenshot of a quick test I done on the web page test. I think it was ESPN.com. Yes, it was. And you can see the quote unquote expense of a lookup, but you're looking at in the order of like 1 second on some requests. On some lookups. So you'll see 1,000 milliseconds here, 1,000 milliseconds there, 500 milliseconds here and there. So these are very costly procedures. Number 10, minification. I mean, that's something that we absolutely do. It's almost pretty much automated at this point, and obviously still very important, because again, you'd be surprised some of the savings that you get out of that. Not extraordinary, but still significant. I like to say it's like chroma subsampling for text files. So any image fanatics out there who know what chroma subsampling is, you'll totally get it. For the others that don't, you're basically, it refers to sort of like removing unnecessary and sort of like redundant data, and then you're able to sort of like have a more compressed file, compressed if you want to call it that. So in 2020, is this something that we look after? Absolutely. Avoiding redirects, that was rule number 11. Again, loosely connected, pardon me, to rule 9, but redirects are absolutely expensive, and especially in 2020 when we're in an age of mobile, like this is something that you want to avoid at all costs. And again, you know, this is something even on a desktop, you can sort of see the effect of a redirect and imagine how much worse it would be just having to deal with the majority of users who are on mobile right now. So something like the redirect, you want to talk about DNS lookups, having to do those over and over again. This is something that we absolutely also want to make sure that in 2020, this is looked after. All right, so that gets the green check. This was actually pretty interesting. I remember when I read this, removing duplicate scripts. Now, I'd even go as far as saying just making sure you remove duplicate files. I don't know how many people here, well, I'll say this much. When it comes to performance auditing, you're talking about being curious. I've always said that I actually have a talk called Optimized Prime, More Than Meets the Eye. Because you know, people will sit there and load a phone, load a site up on their mobile device, and everything looks great. Everything's, you know, dandy. You know, things are placed beautifully on the page. Got it. But unfortunately, the background is like fire and brimstone. It's chaos, and they don't know. And quite often enough, believe it or not, there are duplicate of files showing up, like desktop and mobile, all being loaded together. And obviously scripts, that's going to happen as well. So again, these are things you absolutely want to avoid on several levels, from the fact that it's data waste and potentially having to execute a script that you're not even going to use. Rule 14 was configuring ETags. And again, sort of like closely or loosely somewhat related to the caching strategy. Which rule was that? I can't remember. Oh, rule number 3, in fact. That's my next slide, pardon me. But again, these are things that you definitely want to look into. Not talked about a lot, quite often enough, sort of dealt with through some automation. But I mean, you want to make sure that, you know, you don't have to make a request needlessly, and I mean, dealing on making sure that these are dealt with properly. Sorry, I'm just going to race through this because I want to make sure I get to some of the bits at the end. And rule 14, making ajax cacheable. Again, you know, caching, absolutely. I mean, these are things that at this point in 2020 that, you know, we don't talk about as much, but they're still definitely very important when it comes down to making sure that you have a performant website. Now, these 14 rules what made up the high performance website book. And in 2007, when this came out, this was again monumental, because this is the material that a lot of people had been looking for, and it became a quite popular release. And actually, if you go back and look at some reviews, quite often enough, people talk about this book and saying how much it helped create change. And in fact, it became a bit of a Bible, a bit of a kind of like vade mecum, if you want to say. People carried it with them all the time. It became the absolute reference. And in fact, rumor had it, and this was confirmed by Mr. Souders, that the team got so engaged that they started to post the rules in and around places in the offices at Yahoo. And apparently the 14 rules made their way over to bathroom stalls, believe it or not. So that was actually kind of like a little tidbit that's kind of interesting. But it didn't end there, because in 2007, a lot of things were taking place. And again, Mr. Souders was experimenting, a little bit more, making new discoveries, and he ended up releasing another book, which was obviously kind of a part 2, called Even Faster Websites. And in it, we had more details, obviously more rules, and it was more like more guidance, really. But you start to look at other things like image management, which became a growing problem, and in fact, it is to this very day. We talked about splitting payload, and again, these are the things that became more modern approaches to web performance. Making sure that we avoided blocking scripts, and again, these are things that start to become a sort of kind of like a daily conversation with regards to JavaScript, especially, and I'm going to talk about that as well in a few, with the async and defer. And in fact, Mr. Souders wrote a blog post, I believe it was called "Prefer Defer," basically saying that in all likelihood, you just want to defer the execution as much as you can. Execution is JavaScript, that is. Now, but again, the first book, 2007, the second book, I think it was 2009 or so, 2010. But you'll have to understand also that a lot of things were changing after the first book, because in 2007, there were some significant moments in history. In 2007, and I don't know if you've perused my Twitter feed, but I talked about how in 2006, jQuery was released for the first time. But in 2007, it meant that the browser landscape was Firefox 1, I believe. Safari was like at 2x. IE was around like 6x. And I think Chrome didn't exist at the time. But more specifically, I think we had a significant moment in history in 2007, and that was the iPhone. And what happened there, and I don't want to single out the iPhone specifically, but I think it was something that signified or signaled the arrival of the smartphone. And what happened thereafter was just like endless changing in how we looked at resource loading. And I consider that 2007 moment the first inflection point. In 2016, I think we had what I consider the second inflection point when it comes to performance and the way we think about it, which is the fact that, sorry about that, the fact that in 2016, we had a moment where I think it was like the fall of 2016 where mobile finally eclipsed desktop by like a small significant digit, but it also signaled the fact that this is how we had to think officially. Like some people believe already that we had to take a close look at mobile and how it was basically sort of like growing in popularity when it came to the web. But that moment in 2016 was absolutely the one that stood out in my mind, because once again, people are not going to go back to the desktop. That's it. Like we've hit this point where the mobile is going in a particular direction and will not stop. It may flatten out, maybe, but the fact is that it is going to slowly and surely distance itself from the desktop. And in fact, in 2019, these are the stats. Mobile share is at 53, just under, and desktop is where it's at right there. And again, that may vary from country to country, but the general direction is that mobile is slowly breaking away. And what does that mean? It means that having to deal with resource loading is going to be very important in how we sort of look at it and how we interpret what needs to take place. This is a quote that I like right here. Resource loading is a delicate dance that can be delightful, but also destructive due to device damper and limitation, because there are limited devices out there. But I really like this quote mostly because it's one of my own. Wrote it a little while back. But if you want to talk about device damper, you want to talk about, you know, the limitations. Yes, some of us have iPhone X's. I don't know what they're at right now. I don't think, is it 11 yet? I'm not even sure. But I know myself, I'm just on an iPhone 7. I know people who are generations behind me. Then you start to look at some of the feature phones. In fact, there's a gentleman by the name of what's Aaron's last name? He had a fantastic talk how he grew up in Los Angeles, not very rich. And he had what they called, I believe at the time, an Obama phone, which was a very sort of like stripped down feature phone, really. But he talked about the experience of being in a big city like Los Angeles and not being able to use a smartphone like everyone else, you know, poor, you know, a poor CPU on the device, low memory, you know, not being able to afford like an amazing data plan. So these are things that really come into play, especially now with all the resources that we're sending down the wire. So at the end of the day, yeah, it is complicated right now what's going on in 2020. Even though the 14 rules for 2007, most of them still kind of apply, we've still had to make some major strides along the way to make sure that things are as smooth as possible today, mostly because we are dealing with diminutive devices like the smartphones. So what have we been doing? Well, we've had to do a lot of development around browser APIs. And that's something that I really like to talk about as well, because I mean, the engineers are really sort of like doing backflips to make sure that resource load can be as smooth as possible. And they're giving us as many options and opportunities to create that environment as possible. So things like network information API, which I actually love because you start to like pool the network, you see what's going on. Are you on 4G, 3G? Wait, it's a bandwidth like, okay, cool. You can start to make these sort of like research decisions on that level. Resource hints. I know I sort of touched on it when we were talking about DNS prefetching, but you know, you can do some pre-connecting. It's not a true resource hint, but you can do some preloading. In fact, by the way, I know this is a pretty amazing background. Might be thinking like King Kong might show up soon. But I'm actually at Shopify right now. And a couple years ago, they wrote a piece about how they made some performance improvements on some of their blogs and whatnot. And they talked about using preload to get the fonts loaded up a little faster. Again, dealing with resource hints, trying to do everything they can to make sure the experience is as best as possible. We have things like client hints, but super important things like the paint timing APIs that have been, you know, sort of kind of commonplace at this very moment. Things like first contentful paint. There are a couple others, but FCP is the one you want to look at as closely as possible, because that's one that they spent some time to make sure that it represents a good user experience by having great paid timing API scores. So ultimately, you know, performance, the performance process is now part proof, because it's like, hey, show me some numbers, what's going on here, what's the score on the the paint timings. What is the score on, say, something like, oh my God, what's it called? I'll come back to that in a hot second. But we want the proof, but it's also in part perception. Does the site feel fast? For example, you may have two sites that have the same speed index score, but the same load time, but one has a better speed index score than the other. And the speed index is something that we use to indicate how quickly things show up on a page. So they can still load in, say, 4 seconds, but one may have a speed index score drastically different because we were able to get product on the page, resources on the page faster than the other. So that's why I do say it's in part proof and one part perception. Engineers who deal with performance quite often enough are performers of magic, because they can make things happen despite what may be like an immense amount of resources that have to load on a page. But they also make sure that they make measurements so they can try to make improvements, because you can't improve what you can't measure. Now, with that being said, I talked about YSlow, which was created by Steve Souders. The advent of tools, it's like, whew, there have been so many that have come down the pipe. So we can start by talking about web page test, which is a measurement tool that some believe is pretty much the best on the planet. It may not look the best. There's a lot of information on that page, but once you're able to parse it and read it properly, it is a gold mine. And in fact, Souders can't stop talking about it. And in fact, the companies out right now, SpeedCurve, they actually built their product on top of web page test, as have many others. Tools like Lighthouse. Now, Lighthouse has been, to me, very interesting, because prior to Lighthouse, I found that you never had people really talking about performance that much. They'd be like, yeah, performance, whatever, X, Y, and Z. Now, if you look at Twitter, say, you see people say, hey, I just got 990 on my Lighthouse score performance. I can't wait to see how I can improve it to get 100. So I believe what Lighthouse, which is, by the way, a part of the audit panel in Chrome and Canary, and is actually, you can get an extension as well for it. But I believe they've been instrumental in trying to get the performance conversation a bit more, been trying to get the performance conversation more often. I'm a big believer in DevTools, believe it or not. I think DevTools exposes a lot of information that people tend to not look at. But once again, I think if you are interested in performance in any way, shape, or form, I think DevTools needs to be open 24/7, because you'll only spot these interesting cases when DevTools is open. A website may look amazing when it's loaded, but once you pop that hood open, it's like, oh man, what's going on here? And that's where you see some of the potential, I don't want to say bad practices, but things that you can improve. And then, I threw in about the bundlers, just because JavaScript has become a bit of a challenge. Adios Mani famously wrote this talk called The Cost of JavaScript. And he breaks down in about 45 or 50-minute talk what JavaScript has done to the sort of resource loading and what has to be discussed in that conversation. There's a lot that's happening with that. And in fact, he equates, he feels that, a byte of an image is not equal to a byte of JavaScript. It's just, one does not equal to one, basically. It's really interesting, in fact. Now, how are we going to make these improvements with time? Well, simple. You have to measure. You absolutely have to measure. And I've given this sort of commentary in the past in different talks, you will not improve what you cannot measure. So what does that mean? It means curiosity. It means if you do want to say look at a product that you're going to launch, you have to keep iterating on top of it. You have to make the odd little changes. Are you reaching the goals that you want to reach? Are you making sure that parts of the page that you need to be to have loaded promptly, are they loading as promptly as you need? That's what you have to figure out yourself, but that is done only by means of measurements. That's one for sure. And ultimately, like I said, curiosity, looking at how the assets are loading, going into web page tests, keeping DevTools open, and hopefully at that point, having that sort of routine down pat, you'll be able to sort of make the improvements that need be done for your product or any other project that you feel needs an audit. And with that being said, I did want to put an ending slide, but I forgot to put that out. So that is the conclusion of my talk. I'd be more than happy to answer some questions. Certainly, if you want to ping me on Twitter, I'm available quite often, and I'll try to answer any questions as soon as possible. And I try to time that right.
Yeah, it was great. So I will note there was one question here that's in the Q&A. Does it matter which CDN you use, and how can you tell a good one?
I mean, that's a good question. I'd almost say it's like, A, which car gets me, to B as fast as possible, as best as possible. I mean, they're all generally doing a good job. I can't tell you whether or not one is necessarily better than the other. I will say this though, and it touches on something I didn't really want to get into because it's gotten a little bit complicated, but I'll take a couple seconds to say this. For anyone familiar with HTTP2, and it was pretty much set up to be the sort of savior with multiplexing and things like that, being able to just send a bunch of assets down all at once. Pat Meenan and Andy Davies found out that some servers were not tuned properly. And this is a conversation around the CDNs. So there's a number of CDNs that have not done a fantastic job in terms of making sure that H2 is tuned well so that you could take advantage of prioritization ultimately. So if you really want to get down to it, and I'm not going to call everyone out, but there's actually a list that they put out of the better CDNs because they have H2 dialed down pat. So I'll just leave it at that. I'll probably put out the link on Twitter, and you guys could go check it out.
Thanks for watching.